Historians have told us the glorious stories of the Tudor dynasty for centuries, but the darkest pages of the palace records were never fully opened until a doctor's bag was found in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians in the 1960s. Inside that bag were medical notes documenting the final years of Henry VIII, and these documents were so disturbing that authorities kept them secret for 400 years. Because when England's most famous king died, his body had decayed so much that stray dogs licked the fluids leaking from his coffin. But let's start from the beginning, because this story is not just about the death of a king, it's the story of an empire's shame. And it all began on that fateful January day in 1536, in the tournament arena of Greenwich Palace. The sun was shining on the armor as the 44-year-old king, still in shape, athletic and confident, pointed his lance at his opponent from atop his massive war horse. The noble families in the stands were holding their breath, because the tournament wasn't just a sport, it was a political display, and the king wasn't used to losing, but that day something went terribly wrong. The horses collided, Henry's massive war horse called a destrier stumbled, and the 300-pound armored king fell to the ground. As if that wasn't enough, the horse, wearing its own armor, fell on top of him. The arena suddenly fell into silence. The courtiers froze because only one question passed through their minds. Is the king dead? And for exactly 2 hours, Henry VIII lay motionless on the ground. For 2 hours, England had no king. For 2 hours, the pregnant Anne Boleyn waited in fear for news. And those 2 hours would change everything, because when the king woke up, the man who returned was no longer the old Henry. There was a different light in his eyes, darker, more unpredictable. And his first words weren't relief at being alive or concern for his subjects, but rather he angrily asked why the tournament had been stopped. The Renaissance prince who spoke 4 languages, wrote poetry, composed music, and danced until dawn, that man never truly returned from the tournament ground that day. Instead, a paranoid tyrant emerged, and modern neurologists now know that Henry suffered traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe that day, permanent damage to the part of the brain that controls personality and impulse control. The evidence is very strong. Before the accident, Henry was quite measured for a ruler. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for more than 20 years, and had executed relatively few nobles. But after January 1536, the executions began rapidly. Anne Boleyn lost her head just 4 months later. His most trusted advisor, Thomas Cromwell, would follow. And the king's fits of rage became legendary. Servants would find him crying uncontrollably one moment, screaming for blood the next. But the brain damage was just the beginning, because the same accident reopened an old wound on Henry's leg, and this wound would never heal again. Now, what most people don't know is this. Henry had been injured in the leg years earlier, probably in another tournament. That wound had healed, leaving only a small scar. But the 1536 accident reopened that old wound, and in Tudor England, without antibiotics or knowledge of infection, an open wound usually meant a death sentence, just a very slow death. Imagine having open wounds the size of tennis balls on both legs, not for days or weeks, but for exactly 11 years, constantly oozing, never fully scabbing over. The pain so intense that even the gentlest touch of silk sheets would make you scream. The secret notes of the court doctor, Dr. Thomas Vicary, were found at the Royal College of Physicians in the 1960s, and they describe ulcers of a terrible nature, unbearably painful and foul-smelling. The king's legs had to be drained once, sometimes twice a day. Bronze bowls filled with infected fluid were quickly removed from the king's presence by servants. But Henry, out of pride and paranoia, desperately tried to hide this deterioration. He had special bandages with lead weights designed to close the wounds, believing pressure would heal them. But instead this cut off circulation and made the infection worse. He doused himself in expensive perfumes imported from Arabia, mixing rose oil with amber to try to mask the smell. He even ordered portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous power stance we all recognize. But the infection wasn't just destroying his legs, it was poisoning his entire bloodstream. Every day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his circulation, spreading to his brain, his liver, his heart. Modern medical analysis, based on the symptoms described in period records, shows that Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that constantly releases bacteria and inflammatory compounds into the body. And these toxins cause a cascade of symptoms that turned Henry's life into hell. The constant pain must have been unbearable. Imagine the worst toothache you've ever had, but in your legs, never stopping for over 10 years. Fever came and went, leaving him drenched in sweat one day, shivering with chills the next. His appetite swung wildly between nausea and insatiable hunger. But the most devastating were the neurological effects. Toxins crossing into brain tissue caused violent mood swings that had nothing to do with his actual emotions. One moment he'd be laughing at a joke, the next moment ordering the jester's execution. Paranoid delusions became widespread. He began seeing everyone as enemies, convinced that servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery, that foreign assassins lurked in every shadow. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already looking for his fourth. Young Catherine Howard caught his eye, perhaps a 17-year-old girl to the king's 50 years. The contrast must have been grotesque, an obese king who needed servants to mount his horse, pursuing a young woman. And reportedly, the young girl found his advances so repulsive that she needed wine to endure his bed. But wait until you see what happens when the wounds become infected. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point. The ulcers, which had been manageable if disgusting for 6 years, suddenly worsened. Dr. Vicari's notes describe a change in the color and smell of the discharge. Where once it had been yellowish-white pus, now it turned green, then brown. The smell evolved from merely foul to what was described as the stench of death. Henry's weight exploded during this period. Unable to exercise due to leg pain, constantly eating to distract himself from his misery, the king swelled from an already large 280 pounds to over 350. His armor from 1540, preserved in the Tower of London, shows a 48-inch waist measurement. By 1545, new armor had to be ordered with a 54-inch waist measurement. Think about it, 54 inches, that's wider than most modern refrigerators. The palace had to be modified to accommodate the king's new body structure. Doorways were widened. You can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court. Floors were reinforced with additional beams, when the king's weight created dangerous sagging. Special chairs were made with removable arms because Henry could no longer fit between them. But it wasn't just furniture that was modified. The king's daily routine became an elaborate performance designed to hide his deterioration. He was dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 servants to manage his massive limbs. A pulley and sling system was installed to keep him upright. Then he was transferred to a wheeled chair, though this was carefully concealed from the public. And now I'm going to give you 3 more shocking facts about his real death and the cover-up that followed. So don't forget to subscribe for the truths that historians want to hide from you. Hit the bell. The physical transformation was matched by an equally disturbing mental deterioration. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior that went far beyond mere bad temper into the realm of madness. Henry was having full conversations with people who weren't there. He was observed arguing with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He would call out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old. The most disturbing were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses saw the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during state business, his face draining of color, staring into empty air. He would whisper, "No, not now," or "Leave me," then explode in rage at his confused advisors. A particularly detailed account comes from the French ambassador, describing Henry suddenly shouting at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing. The king's paranoia reached extraordinary heights. He became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired taste testers not just for his meals, but also for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin first to test for poison. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped up on his throne, unable to stand without assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its size, his features deformed by fluid retention. His once bright blue eyes, compared to summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunken deep into discolored flesh pouches. The smell emanating from the royal person had become impossible to camouflage, despite pounds of perfume, regular burning of incense, and fresh herbs scattered on the floors. The stench of decay followed Henry wherever he went. Courtiers would discreetly hold perfume balls to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves and vomit after mandatory appearances before the king. And here's something that will shock you about how he tried to hide his condition. Henry's final portrait, the famous Whitehall portrait that serves as the template for how we imagine him today, contains a devastating secret. When the painting was examined with X-rays during restoration work in 1960, conservators discovered that the king's left hand, which appears to be holding a simple cane, was actually painted holding something entirely different, a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This disturbing staff wasn't just a Gothic fashion statement. Henry had become so obsessed with death that he carried this reminder everywhere. He would tap the skull on the floor during conversations, a nervous tic that disturbed even his most loyal courtiers. The skull itself was said to belong to a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries. Some whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. The portrait artist, Hans Holbein, had accurately painted this disturbing detail, but after Henry's death his son Edward VI ordered it painted over. The young king couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered as a death-obsessed madman. Court records from those final months of 1546 paint a picture of a court in terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that courtiers developed an elaborate warning system. Pages would discreetly signal the king's disposition using colored ribbons, red for rage, black for depression, white for the increasingly rare calm moments. The king would fly into fits of rage over the smallest provocations. A servant who sneezed in the royal presence was dragged away for interrogation as a possible assassin using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court. Her family's lands were confiscated. Most terrifying of all, Henry began ordering executions of people he had already killed, having forgotten he'd executed them years earlier. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that mid-meal, Henry suddenly stood up, a process requiring several servants and causing him visible agony, and began shouting at an empty chair. "How dare you show your face at my table, witch?" he screamed, pointing at nothing. The court froze as Henry continued his tirade against what he clearly believed was Anne Boleyn's ghost. "I took your head once, I'll take it again." Then he collapsed back into his chair, seemingly exhausted, and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. January 1547, Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII enters his final decline, and what happens next is so disturbing that his own government suppressed the records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had become something beyond what doctors had ever seen before. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black. Gangrene was setting in. Clear evidence. The smell had become unbearable. Servants were fainting while changing the king's sheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing cold January weather, because the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a rotting mass. His skin had turned a sickly yellow from liver failure, matching the whites of his eyes, giving him an inhuman appearance. His tongue had swollen so much that he could barely speak. His words came out as wet, gurgling sounds that required his closest servants to translate. His breath smelled of rotting meat, a sign that the infection had spread to his digestive system. The king's massive weight made caring for him nearly impossible. Turning him in bed to prevent bed sores required 6 strong men, though by this point sores had developed anyway, adding to the catalog of rotting flesh. His legs had swollen to such a size that the skin split in multiple places, oozing clear fluid that soaked through dozens of bandages daily. But here's the detail that haunts me about his suffering. On January 20th, Henry experienced what doctors now recognize as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began shutting down. When he produced urine, it was dark brown and reeked of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his already massive girth and creating agonizing pressure on his other organs. The king's mental state during these final days alternated between terrifying clarity and complete delirium. In his lucid moments, he knew he was dying. He would beg his doctors to save him, promising them unimaginable wealth if they could cure him. When they failed to provide relief, he would rage at them, threatening torture and execution, though he lacked the strength to sign warrants. In his delirious periods, Henry revealed the true depths of his terror. He would cry out for his mother, dead for nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from demons crawling up from under his bed. He would have conversations with his brother Arthur, who died in 1502, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pitifully, he would call out for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, asking for her forgiveness, though she had died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier. The court maintained an elaborate facade during these final days. Official announcements continued to describe the king as recovering from a minor ailment. Ambassadors were told Henry was simply resting and would receive them soon. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Edward Seymour and the other members of the Privy Council were already planning for the succession, knowing the king had at most a few days left. On January 27th, Henry suffered what modern doctors would recognize as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely, drool pooling on his pillow as he lost control of his facial muscles. His speech, already difficult due to his swollen tongue, became completely incomprehensible. England's mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion with his words, couldn't even ask for water. Yet even in this state, paralyzed and rotting, Henry tried to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one working hand, he attempted to sign death warrants. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him faithfully for decades but had fallen from favor. The signature was an illegible scrawl, more inkblot than name, but Henry's servants, terrified even of the dying king, prepared to carry out the execution. Only Henry's death the next day saved Norfolk from the scaffold. And here's where the story takes a turn that historians have tried to hide for centuries. Henry VIII didn't die peacefully in his sleep as official records claim. He died screaming. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, discovered in the Lambeth Palace Library in 1983, provides the only eyewitness account of Henry's final hours. The archbishop was summoned to provide last rites, arriving at the palace near midnight on January 27th. What he found in the royal bedchamber shocked even this experienced clergyman. Henry was experiencing seizures so violent that 6 men were needed to hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself further. His massive body convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked. Between seizures, he would vomit black bile, a sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was beyond description. Cranmer wrote that he had to excuse himself twice to vomit. During brief moments of stillness, Henry's eyes would focus on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, for the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his desperate quest for heirs. He begged them to forgive him. He promised to be a better father if only they would come back. Then his voice would change, becoming high and fearful, talking about flames and demanding that someone put out the fire that only he could see. As the clock approached 2 a.m. on January 28th, Henry's breathing changed to what medical professionals call the death rattle, a wet gurgling sound as the lungs fill with fluid. Following Protestant doctrine, Cranmer asked the dying king to give a sign if he trusted in Jesus Christ for salvation. The archbishop took Henry's massive, swollen hand in his own and asked him to squeeze if he died in the faith of Jesus Christ. Henry squeezed once, weakly, then his grip went slack. At 2:07 a.m. on January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII of England was dead. But the horror wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get much worse. Henry's corpse began decomposing at a shocking rate. The infection that had ravaged his body for years didn't stop with death. It accelerated. Within hours, his already bloated body grew even larger as bacteria inside the corpse produced gas. The smell impossibly grew worse. Servants stationed outside the death chamber could be heard vomiting. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death secret for 3 days. This wasn't just political maneuvering. They needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating corpse. The body was too large and too decomposed to display publicly without causing scandal. Embalmers were urgently summoned, but they faced an impossible task. When they opened Henry's body to remove the organs for preservation, they discovered the extent of the internal decay. The liver was so enlarged and diseased that it fell apart when touched. The heart, swollen to nearly twice its normal size, was surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. When the stomach was opened, one embalmer's assistant fainted as such an intense smell was released that workers fled the room. The embalmers worked frantically for 2 days, using techniques that would be considered extreme even by Tudor standards. They packed the body cavity with 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs. They wrapped the corpse in waxed cloth soaked in turpentine. They sealed everything in a massive lead coffin that required special reinforcement to hold the weight. But even these extraordinary measures couldn't stop Henry's decay. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the coffin. pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside the sealed container. The lead began to bulge outward. Officials hurriedly draped more black cloth over the coffin to hide the distortion. Then came the funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 14th. Henry's coffin, weighing nearly half a ton with its reinforcements, required a specially built carriage, pulled by 8 horses. The journey that should have taken 1 day stretched to 3 as the horses struggled with the weight and the roads turned to mud under winter rain. On the second night, the procession stopped at Can Abbey, ironically one of the monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. The coffin was placed in the chapel overnight. Then what happened next was so grotesque that it passed into legend, though contemporary accounts confirm it actually occurred. The pressure from the gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally became too much. The lead coffin split open with a sound witnesses described as like a thunderclap. Putrid fluids leaked out, pooling on the chapel floor. The smell was so overwhelming that guards fled their posts. And then came the final grotesque indignity. In the morning, workers discovered that dogs had entered the chapel during the night. They found the animals licking the fluids that had leaked from the king's coffin. The man who styled himself as God's anointed, who had dared to break from Rome itself, ended up as food for stray dogs. Palace workers used sawdust and lime to soak up the remains, working with cloths tied over their faces. The coffin was hastily resealed with fresh lead, though the damage to royal dignity was complete. When the procession finally reached Windsor Castle, Henry was buried quickly without the elaborate ceremony originally planned. This grotesque scene was so damaging to royal prestige that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ordered all witnesses to absolute silence under pain of death. The official record stated simply that Henry had died peacefully and been buried with all appropriate honors. The truth was hidden so effectively that it only emerged centuries later through private diaries and foreign diplomatic reports. So Henry VIII, the king who executed wives, demolished monasteries, and terrorized a nation, died screaming in rage while rotting from the inside out. His corpse was so foul that his coffin exploded. The golden Renaissance prince, once called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, ended his life as a 400-pound mass of infection and decay, abandoned by his terrified courtiers, his final remains licked up by dogs. If this hidden history fascinated you, I'll amaze you in my next investigation. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation. The past has more secrets to tell. Subscribe to uncover them.